We live on an amazing island, don't we? With lots of wonderful things and lots of wonderful people. To include you guys. Just have a look around. Do you think you're wonderful? Well, maybe the others are wonderful and not you. I don't know how you think about it. But in the midst of all that, our theme this year, this coming year, and we're starting today, is about welcome. And when you look at the world around us, the way God has made it, it is there welcoming us to enjoy life. Every morning, it's a welcome and an introduction to life. Every moment is an invitation of God to enjoy this marvellous, generous gift that we call life. We're beginning our Vision series now in November, well, end of October, nearly November. Normally we would do it in February, but we've decided to move it, well, I suppose I decided, but others agreed with me, to move it to November so that we could talk about it now, so that we could begin the year with that in focus, rather than doing it in February and all of a sudden you're in Easter and you're nearly halfway through the year all of a sudden. So we're going to begin looking at our Vision series for 2023. And I want to start it with a story. Yes, that is Jenny in the middle there. Christmas Day, 1989. Some of you were alive, some of you weren't even born yet, some of you weren't even thought of yet. And Jenny and I and our 3 kids at that moment, and were part of a group of 16 people that went from our church in Melbourne and went to Chennai. We left on Christmas Day and we went to spend 6 weeks in Chennai in India. We arrived about midnight to be welcomed by about 10 or 20 people, all really excited that we were here, and we were absolutely at it, obviously. They were cheering with plenty of smiles. It was a very warm welcome. Then we went back to our apartment, place where we were going to stay. We didn't live in a hotel. We lived in a number of flats with separate rooms, and they cooked for us, which was an interesting excursion in and itself. They fed us curry with rice for breakfast the first morning. That was after we were woken at 5 o'clock in the morning by the mosque across the road from where we lived, blaring, calling everyone for prayers at 5 o'clock in the morning. That wasn't quite as warm a welcome as we'd had 2 hours earlier in the airport. On many occasions over the next few weeks, we spent a lot of time going around visiting people that were associated with the church, the early Apostolic Church of God in India, that had about 4 campuses across the slums in Madras. There's yours truly, if you can make out my face there, standing next to one of the ambassador cars. And the one there you can't really make out, but that's me preaching at the New Year's Eve service at 2 o'clock in the morning, as you do. We visited many homes that looked like this, smaller, some with thatched walls as well. They were normally just one room with a cow dung floor, all nicely polished, with one little oil cooker in the middle of the room. Normally they had electricity. Someone had got some wires and gone up to the electricity wires and connected a set of wires, all totally illegally. A fluorescent tube normally sitting in the middle, maybe a fan, which was always a hazard for me because I was always too tall, so I could have easily been decapitated. And the thing that grabbed us was, for a number of these people, we were the first Westerners that had ever been in that slum. Or certainly not necessarily maybe in the slum, but certainly in their house. So they had got it spick and span for us. They had put on their best clothes and welcomed us into their homes. They would have some food that they had prepared for us, which we were told, don't you dare eat it. You'll be in hospital after it because of they would have got water out of the local river, which that's where all the sewerage went, and that's where they washed their clothes. There would be open drains, sewer drains, not far from their home. And it was some of the most profound moments in my life as we went in those homes and learnt to receive their welcome. Because the most humiliating thing that we could have done was said, oh, no, we don't deserve that honour. We don't deserve to be treated like royalty. We don't deserve to be treated like family. This is all wrong. We should be looking after you. You shouldn't be looking after us. But to honour them, to receive their welcome. It was therefore very difficult not to receive their food, but we had to let our guides set that up for us so that we didn't eat their food. That changed Jenny and my life, those experiences. Just being amongst people that poor and yet learning to have the humility to receive their welcome. For me, that frames what I want to talk about this morning about welcome and the beginning of our series on welcome. Over the next 5 weeks, we're going to look at the theme of welcome through the lens of the 5 different goals that we talked about earlier this year. You might remember that little brochure, little pamphlet that we handed out. Here it is in slightly different form, but it reminds us of the 5 different things that we've been talking about, of what it is that we're committed to here at Hobart Baptist Church, to learning to live like Jesus in Hobart, of creatively expressing life and faith, to nurturing a brave space, to being a place to belong and providing a place to contribute. They're the key things that we want to talk about. And over the next 5 weeks, we're going to look at each one of those through the lens of welcome. And so my task this morning is to look at welcome through the lens of learning to live like Jesus in Hobart. The Bible reading from Romans. Welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. Paul was writing to a series of small house churches in Rome. Don't think church buildings. There was no such thing as a church building till about 300 AD. So there's no church buildings. If you're a follower of Jesus, you met together in homes, often a little bit secretly, because you were considered an atheist in that environment because you only worship one God, not all the gods. So you were not really politically correct to worship this one God. And there were lots of different groups in these house churches. You can imagine everyone met in their own ethnic groups. So the Jews met together in one place and the Gentiles in another, that is, all the non-Jews. And Paul was writing to them both and encouraging them to get together and work together, because the Jews had all the dietary requirements, and what they'd worked out by this time is that if you were a follower of Jesus and you weren't a Jew, you didn't need to follow all those dietary requirements of the Jews. And so Paul's trying to help this group of whole diverse set of followers of Jesus to get on with each other. And in that context, he says to them, welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you. Despite your differences, despite the different ways you live out your faith, despite the different parameters that you put upon each other in your different ethnic groups, welcome one another as Christ welcomes you. I think that's a really profound thing. So let me just unpack that for a little while now. Welcome one another as Christ welcomes you for the glory of God. 3 points, and I'm going to do them in reverse order. For the glory of God, as Christ welcomed you, therefore welcome one another. So let's look at the first one, for the glory of God. If I ask you, what is glory? Could you tell me? I feel that the word glory is one of those words we use and use it often, but when you try to describe it, you go, I'm not really sure what it means. Abundance, maybe, Margaret? Yeah, that could be part of it. Some people think it's shining glory. The glory of God is really the character of God expressed. So another way, it's the character of God expressed that can be touched, that can be felt, that can be heard, that can be experienced. It's the character of God expressed. So things like magnificence, worth, loveliness, grace, power, beauty, generosity, grandeur, love, intimacy, and we can go on, are all part of the characteristics of God and show something of the glory of God. So when you see that something of the love of God, that's the glory of God. So when you see something lovely about a person, that's the glory of the person. So did you know that you're a glorious person? Do you think of yourself as glorious? I don't think most of us do. That's a little bit too difficult, isn't it? But when we live out who we truly are, that is glorious. I think I've told the story here a few times of my dad at one point in our journey, I think it was about 13 or 14, decided that it would be a good idea that we call my dad Graham. That was his name. Thought it was a really cool thing to do. And I remember my grandmother getting her hands on my face and looking, hands on both sides of my face, looking me straight in the eye and said, "Don't you dare, Stephen. There's only one person in the world that you can call Dad, and don't rob yourself of that." I can remember the moment like it was yesterday. But what she was saying, there is something glorious in me calling my dad Dad. Because I'm honouring who God is, who my dad is, because my dad brought me into this world. When I call my mum Mum, I am glorifying them every time I use that word, because that's the essence of the relationship that I have. That's glory. That is glory. So we see the glory of God everywhere, don't we? We see it in a sunset, a mother caring for her newborn baby, which my daughter Alice will be having a baby soon. And Jenny got there safely and said to say hello. She arrived about 36 hours ago in Madrid, all safe and sound. They've already had a baby shower that Jenny was there. I don't know how she got through that, but she did, and she's doing well. A father playing backyard cricket with their sons. For our daughter, Hilary, the glory of God is in a thunderstorm. She loves the thunder and the lightning. And for her, she sees something of the glory of God in that. Every morning, Jenny and I give thanks to God when we're together, and we look out through our windows of our dining area and kitchen and look over the Derwent to the Tasman Peninsula and say, "God, thank you for that beauty." Oh, we don't want to get used to it. We don't want to get used to it. That's giving God glory. What is it for you? I'm sure there are things that happen. It may be a beautiful bit of music. It may be, I don't know what it is for you, a bit of artwork. But something captures you and you resonate deeply within you and you say, I know God's God. That's the glory of God that's captured your heart at that moment. That's the glory of God. Paul says here that when you welcome others, that's the glory of God. When you welcome others, the glory of God is seen in that. That's really interesting, isn't it? And actually you see that theme right through scriptures. In Leviticus, I'm just going to read one of them. God says this to the Israelites. They've come out of Egypt. They're becoming a new people, the people of God. And God says this to them. Don't treat any foreigners who live in your land. Don't mistreat any foreigners who live in your land. Instead, treat them as well as you treat citizens and love them as much as you love yourself. Remember, you were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. You can see where Jesus got the idea, love your neighbour as yourself, can't you? It's written there right back in Leviticus, love your strangers in your midst as you love yourself. And we could go on through numerous passages, through Leviticus, Numbers, Exodus, Deuteronomy. It's all there about welcoming the stranger. Hebrews picks that up, the letter to the Hebrews, where it says, welcome the strangers into your home. By doing this, some people have even welcomed angels as guests without even knowing it. And 1 Peter that we just went through in Living Hope series says this, you say that God is your Father, but God doesn't have favourites. He judges all people by what they do, so we must honour God while we live as strangers here on earth. This expands the idea of loving one another to loving strangers. The Jews and the Gentiles were strangers to one another, so Paul is saying, come on, welcome each other as Christ has welcomed you. And why do we do that? Because that's what God is like. God is the one who forgives and welcomes strangers. God is the one who has open arms for people. That's what we understand and know about God through his revelation and primarily through Jesus. That's why Paul can say, if you welcome others, you are displaying the glory of God, and you're doing it for the glory of God. As Christ has welcomed you. Jesus, we know, was the exact representation of what God is like. The perfect way to understand. If you want to understand what God's like, Jesus is the one. He is the supreme revelation of the heart and the nature of God. He is the glory of God in our midst. And what did he do when he came on earth? Well, he welcomed people. The annoying ones, the beggars who cried out and the disciples tried to shut them down. Jesus said, no, bring them here. He welcomed them. When the kids were the parents wanted the kids, oh, Jesus is a great guy, get him to bless the kids. And the disciples said, no, keep them away, they're only little people, they don't care. Jesus says, no, bring them. So many times you see Jesus saying, no, let them come. Times when Jesus is really tired, he's had enough, but the crowds are following him. What does he do? He takes a deep breath, I'm sure, and says, okay, welcome them. Time and time again. And Jesus even invited himself into other people's houses. Did you know? Think of Zacchaeus. See Zacchaeus, who the rest of the community said, no, you're an outcast, you're not worth anything. Jesus sees him in a tree and says, Zacchaeus, I'm coming to your place. Which basically was, you're going to welcome me? So Jesus is all about welcoming people, but then expecting other people to welcome him. How do you think you would have felt if you were Zacchaeus? If Jesus said, hey Fiona, we're coming round for lunch today. You go, oh no, my house is in a mess. How did the kids leave it? Have I got anything, food? You know, you can imagine what's going through your mind in that moment. But that's how Jesus operated. He expected to welcome people and to be welcomed by people. Welcome was part of what he did. And he was incredibly provocative about it. Incredibly provocative. Because he crossed over all the social norms of his day. He did what you shouldn't be done. He went to Zacchaeus' place. He was not the person you're meant to go and associate with. He sat with the prostitutes and ate with them. He touched the lepers, which meant he was meant to become unclean. But it reversed it and the lepers became clean. He did what wasn't meant to be done, and so the religious leaders got really upset with him because he didn't follow the rules. He was condemned for eating and drinking with the prostitutes and the sinners and all the people that you're not meant to associate with as good religious folk. And I'm sure if you've grown up in the church, you know that sort of spirit. People that you shouldn't be associating with because you're a good Christian. Well, Jesus wouldn't have been a good Christian because he actually broke the norms. And the biggest barrier that Jesus crossed is the big one, isn't it? We understand that he was the Son of God. And he crossed the boundary and became a human being. And then asked us to embrace him. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus came and shared in our suffering and our pain. In fact, Paul would write, he became sin for us. He came into our space and stood with us in our problems. And John says he came to that which he made and we disowned him. He came to those who were his own people. They didn't recognise him. So Paul encourages us to do the same. He says, in the same way that Jesus was welcoming of others, I want you to be welcoming of others, of each other. In the same way Jesus was willing to go into places and ask people to welcome him, I'm asking you to do the same thing too. Jesus is our ultimate role model. And if we're going to live like Jesus in Hobart, and we follow his way of doing things, this is going to mean we might have to live some radical lives. And I know we do. We already do that. We see that in amongst guys. Just look at the round of how many and try and work out how many different nationalities are in this room now. Probably up around 10, 12, 14, 15, something like that. Some of them are all Asian. So sometimes you don't really know the breadth of the diversity of the Asian people amongst us. Then you've got the Caucasians, but then there's a whole lot of different nationalities in the Caucasians as well. Hands up here if you have come to Hobart Baptist Church and found some level of welcome. We're here. Okay, you wouldn't be here if you didn't find a welcome. It's part of who we are already. And it's been part of the history for a long, long, long time of being welcome. And you know what? God says, that glorifies me. I like that, because that reflects my heart. I love it. And I love it when you even feel uncomfortable, but you're still welcome. I love it when you think, oh, I'm not sure about this, but you do it because you know it's right. He goes, God's cheering us on. Because God is an open-armed, welcoming God that encourages us to welcome like he did. Welcome one another. That was what I think Jenny and I learnt in a profound way in India. As that actually learning to welcome others is to actually learn to be welcomed yourself. If we haven't really understood the welcome that others give us or the welcome that Jesus gives us, then how will we welcome others? It makes me wonder about some church groups that are so closed that you can't even get a look in whether they really know Jesus. They say they do, but they don't live like Jesus. It makes me wonder, do you really know Jesus? Have you accepted the welcome of Jesus? See, if the Son of Man, the Son of God, invited himself into my life, am I willing to say, yeah, come in. Come in. And I'm not sure sometimes that we actually feel as if we're good enough to allow Jesus to come into my home. Sometimes we don't feel as if it's tidy enough, or I've got my life together enough, or it's come together, or I say the right words, or it's tidy enough. But Jesus, in the messiness of life, our lives, just like he did with Zacchaeus, the ones that come and say, you know, Rob, I'm coming into your home, and I want to be home with you. And our job is to receive that welcome. And once we receive that welcome, then we'll know what it is to welcome others in the same way. Welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you. Jesus allowed the woman to wash his feet, and the disciples were horrified that he would allow her to do it. And he says, she's done the right thing. How about that for humility and receiving welcome? Then another woman anoints Jesus with oil, and they get cross at her because that was expensive perfume. We could have sold it and given to the poor. And he says, well, she's done a good thing. She's preparing me for my death. And he received it. I just love the way in which Jesus received welcome when it was there. The sad part is that the most religious people missed it. And it wasn't all the religious people who really welcomed Jesus, but it was the people who really were the outcasts, the people who needed Jesus. What does that say about us? If we can't receive God's hospitality of us, we won't be very good at welcoming others and being hospitable and receiving their hospitality. To accept God's love of me, God's acceptance of me, and God's incredible hospitality to me, then I need to open up my heart to God. So that's my framing, our beginning of what is it to live like Christ in Hobart and to be a welcoming person, to be a welcoming community of God's people. And the question is for all of us, have you said yes to God's welcome And have you said yes to Jesus' invitation? I want to come and live with you and be with you. In humility, have you accepted Jesus' invitation to come into your life? I know we feel unworthy. We know we feel that's a big ask. We know that feels difficult. I know that feels uncomfortable. But it helped me when I was in India and going into those poverty-stricken homes and receiving their welcome to help me to understand the depth of humility of heart that God wants us all to have in receiving God's welcome and receiving God's love, and therefore being able to welcome others. You know, this is what the world needs, I'm sure. We live in a cancel culture that's cold and unforgiving. It's filled with a cold aloofness. And Paul calls us to live differently to the world around us. A welcome heart, a welcome church, with welcome homes. When society rejects people, we need to be the ones who accept them and welcome them. When the culture ostracizes people, we need to be the ones who embrace. When the world counsels people, we need to say, no, we want to hear your voice. Regardless of who people are, they should be able to come as they are and find welcome amongst us. Why? Because that's what God's like. And when we do that, we glorify God. And that's what we're called to do. Let me pray. God, thank you that Jesus reveals to us your heart. A heart that is big enough and gracious enough and loving enough to love the 7 billion people that live on planet Earth. And thank you that you love us in the midst of all our diversity, all our brokenness, all our fallenness, all the stuff in our lives that where we reject you, where we are hateful to one another, where we hurt one another. Thank you that you are a God who welcomes us into your family. And you're a God who invites himself into our lives, and the question is, will we accept that invitation? Father, I pray for every person in this room. I pray for all of Hobart, that you would help us to hear the voice of Jesus inviting himself into our lives. But also, Father, I pray that you would help us to be a church that reflects just who you are in the way we are welcoming to one another, to the stranger, to our enemies, and that somehow, by your grace, that will be to your glory. In your name we pray. Amen. Jo's going to come up and she may have some questions or not. I don't know.
Thanks very much, Stephen. So everyone is invited to ask a question. If that's prompted any thoughts that you have, please feel free to send me a message to the church phone.
But not too many. We don't want to be here the rest of the day.
Not too many. Yeah, we just have a couple of questions. So you have posed quite a challenging...
Yep, it is.
A challenging challenge for us as a church community. What are your thoughts on, as followers of Jesus, should we be provocative in the way we welcome and include others? And what does this mean potentially for church politics when others may not necessarily feel the same way?
Yeah, I've thought of that. I've thought through that question. For those who know me, I like to be a bit of a leader under the radar. And that suits me fine. I'm a bit of an introvert. But the more I read about Jesus, and if we live like Jesus, in some areas we put ourselves above the radar. And in a world that seems to be moving further away from the values of God, that means we will actually might become more and more on the radar. And so I think we will end up being provocative without even trying. And not because we've moved, but because the culture's moved. So yeah, my anticipation that somewhere along the line, whether it'll be in my lifetime or whatever, the values that we hold will be provocative in our society. And I'm praying that God will give us the strength and the grace to be able to respond like Jesus would in that moment, so that God's glory can be seen in our response. It's a bit like I said last week, suffering God allows suffering because it actually grows us. It's actually a good thing, even though we don't want it. I don't want to be a provocative church, but I know if we respond to what's happening in the community with the grace and the love of God, that will be to the glory of God. And God might bring it upon us, and we need to be ready for it when it does happen.
So what you're saying is our welcome could have quite an impact on the people we're welcoming, but it actually could have impact in other ways.
Absolutely, yeah. And now I've said this before, but let me tell you what I mean by that is, one of the big things in our community, particularly for our younger generation, is around questions of gender and sexuality. And people are struggling with that. What does it mean to be a church that the community sees of welcoming people who are in that journey? At the moment, if you're a person in that space and you looked at the church across Hobart, I don't think you would say, I think I'll go to that church because they might understand what I'm going through. The general impression they would get is all the churches are really anti us, want to have nothing to do with us, so I won't even bother. So how do we be a place where that are welcoming enough so that we can have the dialogue in a lovely, grace-filled, open way?
And since you brought it up, do you have any ideas about how we could be a welcoming community for the LGBTIQ community?
Part of the reason that we're doing this series is to help God actually learn. Now, we're coming out of a Christendom world. I was saying it at our the Tas Baptist Assembly yesterday. In 2001 at the census, 17.6, I think it was, % of Tasmanians said they had no religion or a secular belief. In the last one, it was 49.9%. In 20 years, it's gone from less than 20% to just about 50%. That is a massive change. And then at the same time, those who call themselves Christians has gone from about 70% down to 38%. That is a massive change. And so we're learning to get used to being followers of Jesus in a world where we're the minority. Hasn't happened in Tasmania ever before. But now we're in the minority. Now, most Christians around the world do that. They live in minority. Just talk to the people in Vietnam and all the rest of it. They live in a minority. We've assumed that we live in a majority, but we live in a minority. So part of it, the answer to your question, no, I don't know yet. But I think as we open our hearts to God, open our hearts to say, well, God, we've got to learn to be a welcoming people. Teach us what on earth that means in our culture, because I'm not sure I know what it means. But we're on a journey to learn. And that's why we want to look at it for the coming year and say, God, teach us. Teach us to reflect your glory in the way we welcome each other. I think we all already do it a bit. Look at all the different nationalities here. We already do it. It's not like we're not doing it. It's in our DNA already. So just teach us how to do it in a way that works in our community today.
Someone's reflected that many people potentially reject Christianity because of the exclusive nature of the gospel, and Jesus claims to be the only way to God, the narrow gate. So this may appear to not be very welcoming. Yeah. How do we kind of balance this narrow gate versus the welcome?
Yeah. Such a good question. I don't know.
Good question.
I don't know really. But here's where I go to try and understand it. This is why for me Jesus is the centre point of it. He's my role model. Jesus did it, so there's a way to learn how to do it, but I don't like where he ended up. Because he ended up on a cross. So actually doing what you're saying, to hold on to values and live in the world with graciousness, kindness, love and compassion and gentleness, all those fruits of the Spirit, actually is really, really hard to do. And it may end up with you being crucified. So the answer to the question, that's why I don't think it's an easy answer. It's a great question, but it's not easy, because when God himself came and lived that life, we rejected him. So that's a tough gig. But there are Christians around the world today doing it. In places like Iran and Iraq or in Vietnam, where it's been really difficult. Talk to Vyong about his story. He had to flee. He was a boat refugee. having to flee Vietnam through the communist era. Our brothers and sisters from Myanmar who have had to flee because they were being persecuted. Like, it's here in amongst us of learning, of experiences of how to do that, and it's not an easy journey. So that's not a really good answer, is it? I don't know, but
I guess some of the questions sort of reflect as well the practical nature of that. You know, how as a church would we respond if someone who looks and smells a bit different staggers into the back of the church on a Sunday morning? What does that look like for Hobart Baptist Church?
And it happens. It happens.
It
you
does.
know, for most of us, you get a different view standing up the front here than you do when you sit where you sit. And that does happen. And I would say generally, I'm not saying we're perfect, but people do find a welcome, generally. And we want to be welcoming about it. Yes, can we learn to do it better? Of course we can. And I think we've got a journey to do that. But I think that's our intent. That desire is there already. So I think the answer is yes. We do that. And let's get better at it.
And I guess just on a final note, is the welcome enough? Where does the welcome go once we've invited people in? What do we do with that?
Well, it becomes a long journey, isn't it? Because our welcome can be a superficial handshake, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about opening our hearts to people, opening our lives to people. So as soon as you do that, you're talking about the rest of your life, maybe. A willingness to say, oh, I might be tracking the rest of my life in relationship now. And it's open-ended. So it's a bit scary because we like to have nice, safe lives, and doing this doesn't make it safe. And we'll talk about that when we talk about a brave space.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Stephen, for starting us on this journey. It is a tricky space, and we look forward to the next
Thank
weeks.
you.